Hi there, I'm Mr. Arkestall and I'm here to give you another video looking at First World War medicine. Now in previous videos we've looked at the context of the First World War, we've looked at the way that the soldiers themselves were fighting, or the kind of battles that they were fighting. In today's video we're going to have a look at the evacuation route and how those injured men got themselves from the front line, perhaps even no man's land, and then all the way back to a hospital, and what stage they did that in. In the last video we looked at transport, so motor transport, horse transport, canal barges, trains, and that way of being able to get the wounded off. And in today's video, video 4, we're going to have a look at the evacuation route. The map behind me is a blown up section of the Battle of the Somme, and you can see you've got 5 miles depicted at the top there, just to give you an idea of scale. And scale is going to be an important part of the evacuation route, bearing in mind how people moved from, like I said, from the trenches or from the front line positions and where they went. First of all, let's start off with the evacuation route itself. So on the tablet here, we've got the evacuation route. And the route starts with the stretcher bearer at the top left. That's the first point, in which case soldiers would find themselves being taken off the battlefield site. Then you would go to the regimental aid post. That was the first place that you would head to. If it was more serious than that, you would get into a motor ambulance or walk perhaps, or be carried on stretcher, or take another form of transport to the advanced aid station, which is a stage that's not on this one. From the advanced aid station, you would then head to a casualty clearing station. So the casualty clearing station, as you can see here, is tented, usually a series of huts, a lot larger. And then potentially, if you still couldn't be treated at that stage, you'd go to a base hospital, usually via a train, because the base hospitals were located quite close to the coast. So the base hospital, you can see just here, was a lot bigger. So they're the 5 stages, really, of getting a wounded soldier off. What I want to do is try and talk you through each of those stages and show you some of the photos of what they were like. First of all, let's talk about the regimental aid post. Once the wounded person had been put onto a stretcher and the stretcher had been lifted up, remember you probably look at about 4 people, 1 per handle, to carry a wounded soldier, then into the trench system. An aid post was designed specifically to give first aid. Most battalions would have a medical officer in charge and a series of orderlies who were medically trained, who could act as stretcher bearers or give aid at various different stages along this evacuation route. But primarily, once you were taken off the battlefield site, the first thing you need to do is get some aid, some medical assistance. And it totally depends on what kind of injury you've got. Video 5 will look at the kind of injuries that soldiers got to work that out, but today obviously we're looking at the route. Regimental aid post, first of all, it's 200 to 300 yards, usually from the front line, so it's very, very close. So if you're suffering from shell shock, you're still going to be hearing the effects of war around you. Not only that, the aid post is going to be very, very primitive. It's going to be based in anything that could be nearby. It could even be in a communication trench. It could be in a dugout. For those that have been on battlefield trips, if you go to the Passchendaele Museum, in the dugout there, you can see a little regimental aid post within that dugout where they're conducting some sort of operation. Apart from that, it could be a deep shell hole, or it could be the ruins of a building. These are places that the aid post would go, that you would go to, and it was where you would get your most immediate medical assistance to be treated. So first of all, here's our stretcher bearers. This is taken from the Canadian Museum. Beautiful painting here of a stretcher taking a wounded man off the battlefield site. And here's our aid post. Notice here, this one is in a ruined building. Notice you've got the medical orderly around, you've got the first aid symbol in the background. The stretcher's just been laid down on the floor, which suggests that this person is about to be treated or given some sort of care or attention. And the idea behind the aid post was to get these soldiers back up onto the feet. In every stage of the evacuation route, it was designed to treat the soldier as quickly as possible to get them back onto the front line positions. In particular, the first thing you would have really at the aid post is the initial aid. Whatever the issue is, whether it's bleeding, whether it's loss of sight from gas attack, whatever, you'd be treated there. If you were able to be treated, you could then return back to the front line and you'd be fine. If, however, it went to the next stage would be an advanced dressing station. The clue there is in the name advanced. But also the fact is that as a dressing station, it's not designed to be, again, another serious element of medical. It's not a hospital, for example. So if you think of how you would dress a wound, you're usually bandaging, you're usually looking after the wounds. This is how I try and imagine the evacuation route. Once you've been lifted off, you're going to get first aid. So that's your regimental, because they're the group that look after you. So the regimental aid post is your first stage. If it's more serious than that, it then moves to the advanced dressing station. Another painting, this is a beautiful painting, which shows you the fact that the advanced dressing station is a lot busier than the regimental aid post. The aid post is a lot smaller, but here at the advanced dressing station is a lot bigger. Now, men here were either ill or injured, arrived, and then were usually sent back if their cases weren't that serious. However, at the advanced dressing station, you'll normally double the distance from the front line, so you're about 400 yards roughly. There's no real tried and tested method here. There's no real rule on location either. Again, ruined buildings, dugouts, bunkers, anything that offers some sort of protection from enemy fire is a really important place to be in the advanced dressing station. It's generally staffed by the Royal Army Medical Corps, so you've got trained individuals here. Here's another image here. This again is an advanced dressing station. This one is slightly more out in the open, but you can see here the exhaustion on their faces. Advanced dressing stations often found themselves overwhelmed once the battles had started to take place. So the Battle of the Somme, for example, back there, if you bear in mind a few yards, 100 yards or so behind the front line, you've got aid stations and then advanced dressing stations quite close to this red line here. So the advanced dressing station, like I said, is a little bit more improved than your aid post. There's going to be a little bit more kind of facilities there, but it's not going to be serious operations or things like that. We then move ourselves on to the next phase of the transport route, which is the casualty clearing station. And the casualty clearing station was a much bigger facility, and it was usually tented or included huts. And the advanced dressing station was usually a place where the more serious illnesses could be treated more long term, that would involve beds and so on. Again, transport system wise, you're going to be either horse cart, carriage, motorised ambulance getting to the casualty clearing station. And one of the most impressive casualty clearing stations that we've ever visited was Essex Farm. So Essex Farm is actually on very close to the front line in Belgium near Ypres. And it's famously where John McCrae, the chappie that wrote In Flanders Fields, was based. And he worked for the Army Medical Corps. He was a Canadian. And the station actually looks a little bit like this. This was concrete. So it's a little bit more advanced. And and here you can actually see the facilities really on this map here. Brilliant little picture. But this picture gives you a kind of an idea. This is from 1917 of the facilities that you've got inside. So in each of these little bunkers, you've got wards, you've got dressing rooms, you've got stretcher cases, on officers' mess. You've then got various different stores and facilities. So a really quite an advanced location. Here's what it looked like at the time. So we've got a photograph here with sandbags at the entrances and a couple of soldiers here, probably waiting for the injured to arrive. You can see the wooden boarding just here. Interestingly, in 2001, they did a dig out at Essex Farm, and they found that there was a small railway line actually connected nearby that had been buried over, which goes to show that these clearing stations and dressing stations needed a form of transport to get the wounded off as quickly as possible. Okay, so let's talk now about this casualty clearing station a little bit more. So dressing stations, like we've said and like we've seen, dressing stations tend to be a smaller affair. The casualty clearing stations are larger, usually hutted, or they are usually tented areas, and these will accommodate usually about 1,000 casualties at a time. Again, they could be overwhelmed, but we're talking here really a much further distance away. We're probably talking a couple of miles. So bear in mind there's 2 miles here. You're probably talking about Albert, or certainly around the Albert area, away from the front line on the Somme. you'd have these clearing stations. Now, the idea was that you'd be patched up again and then sent on your way. However, it's here that you would see a lot more nurses working. We'll talk about them in our next video when we talk about the wounded and looking after the wounded, because we've already talked about the Royal Army Medical Corps, but the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry and the Voluntary Aid Detachments were two voluntary female organisations that came to assist with the doctors in a lot of these positions. Some were out there on the front line. There were very few examples. There were two women in Belgium who were actually honoured for creating a truce, I think this was in 1917, to allow the wounded of both German and British to be cleared from the battlefield sites at the time. But it's very rare to actually get the women right at the front line like that. They're the two examples I could think of. However, most of the time you would see the VADs and the FANY in these casualty clearing stations and base hospitals. Now, the clearing stations were much more advanced, and these things were kind of like little camps, really. This example here you've got is a tented site, and you could see the duck boardings down there. You've got the building in the background. Inside, there were fantastic structures which had beds, proper medical equipment going on here. Then we've got a nurse, we've got a doctor here. Wonderful painting here, which really encapsulates what's going on in these clearing stations. And often, like I said, they would be these would certainly be on a train line. One of the most famous ones that we've visited before is the one at Leeuwenhoek, which is behind the lines in Belgium, and a little railway ran alongside this casualty clearing station. It became very famous for the large number of international individuals. Sadly, any people that died, any soldiers that died in these places, particularly the clearing stations, would be buried nearby in cemeteries. So Leeuwenhoek Cemetery is one of the largest cemeteries out in Belgium. And in fact, it has Americans, French, Chinese, Dutch, Belgian, French, British soldiers, all within the same plot. It's a fascinating place to visit. The Chinese, in fact, were a labour corps, so they were the ones that were helping clearing the battlefield sites and moving supplies and so on. And although it's not part of the course that we're looking at, a very interesting part of the First World War. Anyway, like I said, during the work that was done in the casualty clearing stations, the kind of things that took place included operations on limbs, kind of advanced operations in terms of cleaning out wounds, maybe sewing up holes or shrapnel bursts that have marked and scarred the body. So we're looking at more kind of intense operations taking place here. And I just want to kind of give you another sense of scale with this image. This is Leeuwenhoek. And with the blue buildings you can see on the map, you can see the word hospital there. The train line is this little blue line that runs across the top just here that brought the wounded in to the hospital. And you can see the blue kind of like buildings or huts that were constructed. There's now a visitor centre at the site where you can go and it'll tell you more about what was going on there. But this again was quite a large place, and this is where you get, like I said, the more serious gas gangrene perhaps. Anything that again could be treated whilst you're out there in Belgium or France. You're a lot further away now, like I said, from the front line, so it's a much better location to be in. However, if it became much more serious than that, then your next phase would be a base hospital. So we've gone from the stretcher to the aid post, we've gone to the advanced dressing station. If you're still not good enough to be treated at that point, you'd probably be stabilised, then moved on to the casualty clearing station. If your situation deteriorated even more, you'd then go to your base hospital. The base hospitals were a lot nearer to the coast. The idea was that if you were that seriously wounded, you could be treated in a much more specialised building, usually a civilian building. So there were two types of base hospitals, stationary and general. Stationary hospitals were the ones that were already there, the civilian hospitals, and they were just converted into military hospitals where they looked after the wounded, the sick and the ill. And then you have your general ones, which were then purpose-built places, usually again near train lines that would allow the wounded to be evacuated. The reason why they were near the coast, because if things did get that serious, they could put you straight onto a ship and you'd be back in Blighty, back in Britain, where you could go to a medical facility there. Now, for anyone that remembers Downton Abbey, you'll know that they turned a lot of these big stately homes into hospitals, and that's exactly what happened, really. You tended to find that the final ultimate destination on the evacuation route, if it was really severe, so take shell shock, for example. Craig Lockhart's up in Scotland is a location where men suffering from shell shock would be transported to be looked after. And during the war, that one location looked after something on the lines of about 2,000 men. Another interesting link is if you look at the cemeteries, the war cemeteries in this country, and you actually find somebody from the First World War buried in a cemetery, it's more than likely they were evacuated, especially if it was any dates between like 1914 to 1918. It's more than likely they were evacuated through this line, were convalescing, so they'd wear little blue uniforms to denote that they were soldiers who were convalescing, getting better from their illness, from their wounds, and they would basically stay in Britain until they were better to go back into the trenches. It happened to Walter Tull. Famously, Walter Tull got trench fever, which we'll talk about next video, and it was whilst he was recuperating that he trained to become an officer. He then returned as soon as he could. By 1918, he was fighting around Arras. With these base hospitals, like I've said, I've already mentioned the fact that you've got two types, the stationary and general. It's here that you've got a much bigger set of individuals taking part, and here we've got a photograph of the staff that you would see at either a casualty clearing station or a base hospital. Your Royal Army Medical Corps officers, which we can see here, sat or stood, and then your nurses. The nurses themselves were different to the voluntary aid detachments and the first aid nursing yeomanry. These nurses were trained and they would accompany the doctors, and they would be based at the base hospital, whether that's in Britain or by the coast over in Belgium or France, or they might even venture as close as the casualty clearing stations. You wouldn't get them in the advanced dressing stations or anything further down into the battlefield zone. So that really is your evacuation route. So you start off with your recovery from the battle. Then you'd move to an aid station, and a phrase that was usually associated with groups of men that picked up and transported the ill and the wounded were field ambulances. These weren't motorised vehicles. A field ambulance was actually a group of men who were used as bearers, who would transport the wounded from location to location, offering first aid. So your first step, lifted by a field ambulance, your men with the stretcher bearers moving you to an aid post, usually in a communications trench, and then from the communications trench, perhaps you'd go to an advanced dressing station to be patched up or looked at with a bit more equipment. If it's much more serious, it then goes to a casualty clearing station. At that point, if it's even more serious or it's something that can't be treated there and needs more proper medical equipment, then it goes to a base hospital, larger facilities, usually like hotels, hospital buildings that were used to house them. And that's the end really of the evacuation route. This does tie in with the next video, which will look at the kind of illnesses and the kind of wounds, and I'll try and bring out some of the objects that I've got to try and help highlight some of the problems that the soldiers had to work with. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.